Kitco News special coverage of the Future Blockchain Summit is brought to you by Coin Payments, crypto payments made easy.
Welcome back to our coverage of the Future Blockchain Summit here in Dubai. I'm Michelle Makori. Over 100 countries are exploring the idea of a central bank digital currency, or a CBDC. Israel is one of them, and in fact has been a trendsetter here, ahead of the curve, having looked at launching a digital shekel since as early as 2017. But the Bank of Israel has yet to decide if it will or if it will not indeed go ahead with it. In the interim, though, Israel has been cooperating with the Bank of International Settlements, Norway, Sweden, as well as Hong Kong, on a number of initiatives. Here to discuss them all, including where Israel stands with its digital shekel, is Yoav Soffer. And Yoav is the advisor to the Deputy Governor of the Bank of Israel. He is the CBDC project manager, so certainly very qualified to address this topic. And you've also worked as an advisor at the World Bank. Very good to have you with us, Yoav.
Thanks for having me. Happy to be here.
Tov lirot otcha. Okay, a bit of Hebrew to kick things off. So, Yoav, Israel, first world economy, has a very effective and efficient financial system. Essentially, most of the transactions are done digitally anyway. Effectively, you have a digital shekel as the system operates currently seamlessly. So why do we even need a central bank digital currency? Why does Israel's central bank need to launch its own digital version of the currency?
Yeah, thank you for this important question. It's actually really a valid question, and we haven't really answered it yet. That's why we really haven't made a decision yet. But let me just say one thing kind of conceptual, then try and dive down quickly to the motivations that we have possibly identified at the Bank of Israel. First of all, conceptually, the public has always had a choice between central bank issued money, cash, and commercial bank issued money, our bank deposits. And as the time goes by, more and more of our payments become digital, and central bank money is becoming less relevant for our payment needs. So it just may be the case that we need to leave the choice for the public whenever they want to pay with central bank money or commercial bank money, also into the digital era. So this is something just conceptual to think about. Then in Israel, we've identified actually a number of 6 motivations. I'll try and go over them really quickly. We'll probably touch them also down towards the discussion. The first is competition. Okay, cash is actually putting a competitive pressure on the commercial payment system. And if cash disappears, it may be the case that the banks, or maybe even the big techs, or maybe even future stable coins or global stable coins or whatever, may actually conquer the scene and maybe even get us towards a winner-take-it-all situation. So we need to have the central bank in the payment game also in the future, just as another alternative to maintain competition. Another motivation is innovation. Actually, if we think about our money today, it's pretty quite stupid. Okay, we can only pay with the money. We cannot link any other transaction to the money. We cannot relink data to the money whatsoever. We can only pay in a minimal volume transaction. For example, we can't really do micropayments with the current money that we use. Central bank digital currencies may actually bring some of these innovations towards the payment scheme, and then, of course, with an important participation of also the private sector. Another thing we've identified actually is cross-border and privacy. We could probably talk about them down the road. But in Israel, also resilience is also a very important thing to think about.
So the idea is that physical cash is being used less and less by people in Israel, and they're more reliant on banks and private enterprises for their financial transactions. So the government wants to perhaps step in and offer an alternative to how that system is managed.
Yeah, so the central bank is just telling itself we need to maintain our relevancy for people's payments need, as we have been for decades, also into the digital.
All right, let's cover some of the basics here. If Israel were indeed to launch a CBDC, how would it be distributed? What would the process be?
Right, so most central banks, and maybe all, and ourselves included, are actually thinking of CBDC being distributed in a 2-tier model. That means that although the CBDC is actually a liability of the central bank, the end user, would not be approaching or would not be contacting the central bank to receive or to pay with the CBDC. So we would have financial institutions, or maybe even not financial institutions, maybe they could be just technological companies, fintechs, whatever sort of institutions that would be liable to actually connect to our technical system and actually provide the app to the end user, the app or the card or whatever be the interface. We can talk about this later. And that's actually also where the competition would lie. So some institutions would be better at cross-border payments, other may be better at actually providing an easier interface for the elderly or whatever. And
but essentially it would be an app with an e-wallet on an individual person's phone, for example. And
so that is the most kind of common and reasonable interface to think about. Probably most of us would also want to use it on our phones, but we also need to think about the people who are not digitally oriented or maybe cannot afford a phone. In Israel, for example, we have a large chunk of the population that does not use a smartphone for religious reasons, and we need to honor that. So you can also think of CBDC being used on a simple card or something like that, maybe even a bracelet that even my 85-year-old mother could use just paying at the store. She is not able of operating her smartphone anywhere. So yes, there would need to be some kind of end user interface. These days we can think of smartphones. In the future, who knows what it will be, but which will be provided to us by private sector entities that would connect into the CBDC system.
And there would be an intermediary between the central bank and the hardware technology and the end user.
Right. So these are those private sector intermediaries, but we're thinking of them not necessarily as financial institutions because they would not be touching the money. This is actually what we are exploring currently in Project Sela together with the Hong Kong Monetary Authority. We're thinking of those intermediaries as entities that merely provide me the technical access towards the CBDC system. They are not like credit card issuers and merchant acquirers these days who actually touch the money. They hold the money between the end user and the merchant, for example. They hold the money for, 15 days, 30 days, whatever. They're just merely providing me the technical access, and therefore they may be actually posed to less financial regulation than financial institutions these days.
Well, you mentioned the financial institutions, and of course one questions their role in all of this, because if payments are seamlessly made between the central bank directly to the end user, you really don't necessarily need the financial institutions, at least in as big a capacity, because they're the middlemen in here.
First of all, the financial system has a very important role in the economy as a financial intermediator. Okay, the financial system intermediates between savers and people who take a loan.
Borrowers.
Borrowers.
Lenders and borrowers.
Yeah, lenders and borrowers. Thank you. And this is, of course, a very important function of the banking system. For example, the central bank will never replace that. Okay, so it's very important that commercial banks, payment institutions remain in the game. Also, if you want to think of innovation, at the end of the day, us public sector people,
So you mean people would still need a need for the banking sector so that they can deposit their money in order to get interest, for example, and then which would allow banks to then fulfill their traditional function and loan out that money to other people that need money.
For example, if we do too much of a good job and actually move too much of the public's deposits from commercial banks to central bank money, we will have a very serious problem. We need the banks to maintain their liquidity, maintain their capital, and continue to do their important functions.
So you don't necessarily see this then as a threat to the traditional banking sector?
Well, it could be a threat, so we would need to manage that threat. For example, one way to manage it would be to limit the amount or the balances that people may be allowed to hold on their CBDC wallets, for example. This is actually, I was talking about this in this presentation in the earlier stage. There are really two kind of opposite risks here. Some people are telling me, oh, come on, you'll be building a white elephant. No one will want to. I mean, you were asking me in the beginning, right? Why would people want to use it? We have a good enough payments system already. So one risk is the risk of like a white elephant that would be doing this and no one would be using this. The completely opposite risk is the risk of that we're doing it too well and people will prefer CBDC as opposed to commercial bank deposits, and then we might have the risk of bank disintermediation.
So you're going to need to iron out things, like you said, how much of their money they can keep in the actual wallet,
for example,
to maintain the functionality of the traditional financial system, which is very essential to the financial ecosystem in many ways. Is the idea, though, to make cash obsolete, to completely eliminate cash?
No, absolutely not. The Bank of Israel will continue to issue cash as long as the public, or as long as parts of the public continue to prefer cash. Cash has its properties that are very special. First of all, for example, cash serves us well in times of emergency. We saw that in COVID, actually in Israel and in other countries, the demand for cash has increased substantially. And some people prefer the use of cash. It's also maybe a generational issue. Maybe our kids will not be using cash as much as we still sometimes prefer to, but we will definitely continue to issue cash, at least for the coming years or maybe even decades, as long as the public requests to continue.
Well, that's it, decades. Is the end game to phase out cash entirely and make CBDCs mandatory?
This is not our goal and not our end game. No, our goal is to offer the public a digital means of payment issued by the central bank into the digital economy. If the public wants and prefers to continue to use cash for some of their transactions, they will be able to continue to do that as long as they wish.
Yeah, well, there is, of course, a big issue of distrust when it comes to central bank digital currencies and taking the government's word that it would maintain the optionality. Again, a more philosophical issue, but focusing on the idea of what cash offers. It offers privacy and anonymity. And one of the major concerns with a central bank digital currency is that essentially the government will be able to know every single transaction that an individual or business makes, that you will have complete access to that kind of information. How do you plan on tackling the issue of privacy?
Okay, so cash has its anonymity and its privacy, and it carries its advantages and its disadvantages. And we are all aware of the problems and disadvantages of the anonymity that cash provides. Okay, we all understand issues of money laundering and tax evasion and stuff like that. So CBDC would never be as anonymous as cash is. However, it may be possible for us to allow some limited privacy for the use of CBDC. There are currently actually technologies that allow us to control the extent of privacy that we may want to offer for the end user. For example, we've experimented the technology based on zero knowledge proof mechanism that allows us to, for example, to allow the public two types of digital shekels, for example, in their wallet. You could have like a monthly budget of anonymous transactions, and the state could decide on that budget. For example, maybe we can allow $100 a month for each person to do completely anonymous transactions. Okay, there's no money laundering risk in $100 or $200 a month or whatever be the limit. And then the rest of the transactions would not be anonymous. But also, looking at it, we're talking about what our children will be preferring in the future. Many of us are giving up our privacy voluntarily in so many aspects of our life. Many of us are actually enjoying the fact that our payment providers have information about our payment habits, and therefore they're able to provide us all kinds of services and stuff like that. So I think many people will also have different choices regarding what they want in this.
Well, let's focus a little bit on this hybrid solution that you're suggesting that the Bank of Israel is exploring. So the idea is to have a designated amount of private digital shekels, and those transactions will not be on the blockchain? Or how would they maintain their privacy, the private digital shekels?
So this is really just a technical experiment that we made just to manifest the fact that there are technological alternatives, and we are not at the current. Currently, what we have two completely distinct situations. We have cash, completely anonymous. We have commercial bank money. Financial institution knows everything about my transactions. The idea of this experiment was to manifest the fact that we actually have options in the middle. Okay, and we may be able to provide the public with a digital means of payment, which would be anonymous for a limited extent, that we as policymakers or the government or the parliament as the policymaker could make the decision on the amount of this, as opposed to something that would be on the ledger and available for the central bank, for example, to. So
essentially, the government would decide how many private digital shekels an individual has.
Assuming that we want to adopt this model. Once again, this is just an experiment that we haven't made any decisions.
But that touches on a much bigger issue here, a big point of concern, and that is government control and government overreach. Because how would the government decide, well, individuals only get this amount of privacy shekels and businesses get that amount of privacy shekels? You're sort of subject to the whims of the government here, which is one of the issues of freedom that central bank digital currencies threaten in many people's views.
I want to think that central bank digital currencies actually will allow more freedom for people. We'll get back to this in a minute. But answering your question directly, We just had a legislative process in Israel over the last, it started I think maybe 5-6 years ago, where the government actually came to parliament and asked to limit the amount that people can do in a single cash transaction. Okay, so the limit was initially around 11,000 shekels, something like $4,000 per single transaction.
I mean, in a single
transaction.
On a
single
card?
transaction. No, not on credit card, on cash.
Okay.
So like, let's assume you're a service provider, like I don't know, you're an electrician fixing my electricity in my house, okay? And you come and you fix my electricity and then you ask for the payment. I am not allowed to pay you more than, it was 11,000 shekels and now 6,000 shekels in cash. If I pay you more than 6,000 shekels in cash, we both broke the law. That's the current state in Israel. This was agreed upon by the Israeli parliament after a very long debate that took place in parliament, which the debate really brought together, first of all, the public interest of fighting the illicit and the black economy and tax evasion. We have a serious problem with tax evasion in Israel, as many other countries may have, as opposed to the people's right for privacy and for the right to choose their own means of payment. So all I'm saying is we've had this sort of public, political, social debate in Israel, for example, on the limitation of cash. The legislation is already active, and we may need to do this decision once again.
But technically, people are still able to do that. I realize it's breaking the law, but it's still up to them to decide if they want to break the law or abide by the law, as opposed to a scenario where...
If people want to decide that they want to break the law, it's not my role as a central banker to worry for them, for their concerns, okay? People who want to break the law are people who want to break the law.
Well, again, as I say, this goes back to this idea of making it easier to enforce laws, and some laws we agree with, others we may not as a society, and goes back to the idea that it does allow for more government restrictions. But just back on this concept of a private digital shekel, because I'm quite fascinated by that, wouldn't there be perhaps in like a black market for those digital shekels that are private? Wouldn't there be perhaps a higher street value for them?
No, that could be technically solved, I think, very simply. So, I mean, the private digital shekels of my allowance will only live privately on my wallet.
Okay.
So once I paid you and you're already over your budget, over your monthly budget, they would not be private. It wouldn't be a different token.
So how would they be private then? If the government knows that they're the private ones and they're only living on my wallet?
So I am not capable of explaining the technology, unfortunately. This is actually a technology that was developed by VMware, and we applied it. But from what I understood, so I would have like 100 private digital shekels in my wallet. If they move to your wallet, they become kind of regular digital shekels. You can still pay according to your monthly allowance or whatever is private in your wallet.
But the transaction of whom I pay them to would not be visible? Is that the idea?
So if I'm still under my monthly allowance or my whatever time period that we decide on, if I'm still under my periodical allowance, the transaction would be completely anonymous, just like cash. If I'm over my monthly anonymous, the transaction would be recorded on the ledger.
I mean, I realize that this is...
Really, it's just a concept. It's just to understand that we have all sorts of policy choices when we design this in the future.
I realize that this is a work in progress and that Israel is just exploring this as a potential way to move forward and looking at the problems and looking at the issues. But again, one of the biggest concerns is the idea of government overreach, government restrictions. Would the government essentially be able to cut people off the system? Would the government essentially be able to program a central bank digital currency to say, Michelle, you can't spend any more money this month? Especially when you look at it in the context of the ESG narrative. And there's growing concern that we're going to move into a system of carbon credits, for example, and that the governments will regulate how much money I can spend on what is deemed to be environmentally unfriendly practices. So can there be a scenario where central bank digital currency says, I've bought 4 plane tickets already this month, I've exceeded my carbon emissions, and my digital currency is programmed to not work if I try and purchase something that would exceed my carbon allowance, for example?
I'll try and give 2 different answers to this very significant concern. First of all, I am lucky to be born, raised, and live in a democratic country. and I am very lucky to be a public servant in a democratic country. And I can witness on my organization that we always operate on what we understand is the best public interest. If the government starts operating against the general public interest, and sometimes my interest is different than your interest, and it's different than the public interest. But we have a parliament, an elected parliament, and the governor of the central bank is appointed by the president. And call me naive, but I do believe in my institution and in our institutions, and in the fact that we will always be operating to the best public interest. That's the first part of my answer. The second part of my answer is that really, if you think about it, the government can probably do a lot of the things that you mentioned earlier already today. And in fact, when did you last buy a plane ticket using cash? Probably a long time ago, right? So our ability to use cash for many of these things is disappearing anyway.
Right.
So I really don't see a situation where people withdraw back to cash in a significant amount because they want to start escaping all sorts of government limitations.
Well, 2 points on that. The question is less about using cash and more from a technical side. It would make it easier for a government to then control the spending. Now, you mentioned Israel, great democracy. I live in the US, but I work for a Canadian company. Kitco is based in Canada. And recently we have seen a democracy like Canada demonstrate government overreach. For example, the Trudeau administration.
Without CBDCs.
Correct.
Right? So
correct.
That's exactly what I'm saying.
But the Trudeau administration cut off money to truckers who were protesting vaccine mandates and asked lenders to cut off the people that were supporting them financially. Now, I get your point that you don't necessarily need a central bank digital currency to do that. But my question is, doesn't it make it a lot easier then for the government to do that? They don't even need to try and persuade the lenders or the financial institutions to go along with that or issue some kind of emergency act. It makes the process of government control over the money a lot simpler, and that is a big concern. And we've seen it being violated in democracy like Canada.
So first of all, I'm not sure when there are elections in Canada, but I mean there will be elections in Canada at some point, and Canadians will get their chance, to express their opinions on this. I'm not expressing mine, of course. Once again, I think going back to the basics of the discussion, we, the central banks, have been offering the public with a means of payment, physical means of payments for centuries. The commercial banks have also been doing this, and their means of payment has been advancing with technology. If the central bank's means of payment does not advance with technology, it will probably become obsolete to the point where it is not usable at all.
I get that argument, and I get that side of it. But again, from a technical perspective, is it easier for a government to program a central bank digital currency to say, we're not happy with somebody's political views, we're cutting them off the system? To censor it, to censor people, to cancel people, to restrict? Would a CBDC, technologically speaking, make that process easier?
I am not a technical person, so I'm not able to answer you. Would it be easier for the government to do it with a CBDC or without a CBDC? I am a policymaker, and I can tell you that from my understanding of how we would make policy, we would not make policy which is not be legislated and would not be in the general public interest all at all. This is really all I can say about that.
All right. Have faith in Israeli politicians. Well, speaking of the policy side of things, what would need to get this approved? Is this something that the Israeli parliament, the Knesset, would have to vote on? Would there be a nationwide referendum rather, like we saw with Brexit type of thing? What would be the process to get a central bank digital currency passed? I know, again, you're just exploring this, but what have been some of the conversations then?
I'm not sure we have referendums in the Israeli legislation. I don't think we ever had one, but answering your question seriously. We're looking into that. We're actually trying to look at the existing legislation and understand, assuming that the central bank decides to issue a CBDC, can we do it autonomously just upon the decision of the governor, or will we need to go to parliament? But I can assume that even if the legal answer is that the central bank has the authority to do it itself, you would probably, this is such a significant reform, and we just spoke about the social and political implications of it. It would probably not be the case that the central bank would just do it on its own. And if the governor decides to go on with his plan to issue a CBDC, I'm assuming that he will probably look for both governmental and parliamental support and enhancement for this.
You have a lot of faith in the institutions of the democracy of the State of Israel, and that's a wonderful, beautiful thing. Perhaps I'm a little bit more jaded in terms of trust in government at large, but I hear your point that these issues still need to be resolved. One of the other big issues, other than privacy, other than government control, is the idea of cybercrime and cyber hacking. Now, Israel is a global leader in cybersecurity. Startup Nation has come up with several solutions in order to fight cybercrime. How are you addressing that issue? I believe that there's some collaboration with Hong Kong on the idea of cybercrime, but you not only have the issue of wallets themselves being hacked, and we've seen examples of that just recently with Solana, but the whole system being hacked. How are you addressing that issue?
Right. Actually, it's interesting because just because of this two-tier model that we spoke about earlier, you're actually kind of increasing the interface risk, right? Because if there would be many intermediaries who are allowing the public to access CBDC, so it's not just a single point, right? And you can maybe access and try to harm the system from many entry points. Once again, I'm not a technical person. I can just say that we are indeed, what we're doing in Project Sela together with Hong Kong Monetary Authority, we're actually bringing Israel's cybersecurity expertise into the global CBDC debate. All I can say once again, in faith of our abilities, is that just as we've been able to cyber secure our financial system so far, we should be able to cyber secure the CBDC system if we decide to build it. And it will definitely be a challenge because once again, the CBDC system will actually, at the end of the day, provide access to every end user into some kind of or another of a vital central bank system. So you would actually be allowing many people accessing what is the system that is providing the central bank money, and definitely you need to think of cybersecurity very thoroughly before you advance and do this.
So that is still one of the issues that Israel is looking at before deciding to go ahead with the project, trying to figure out those details, because again, it wouldn't just be the monetary system, then you've also got the risk of individuals and their wallets being hacked. And I would think that Israel would perhaps be in a more precarious position than other countries because it is a victim of regular terrorist attacks in other ways. Do you think that Israel would be more of a target rather for cyber terrorism, given some of the geopolitical dynamics in the region?
It's interesting. So, our cybersecurity people at the bank tell us that our systems are being attacked dozens of times a day or something like that, and we, the end users, don't even know that because of the good job that they're doing. So, there's probably a point in what you're saying. On the other hand, I can tell you that one lesson that we are learning from cash is that actually counterfeiting of shekels is into a much lesser percentages than counterfeiting of euros or dollars, for example. Because from the counterfeiter's point of view, it is much less worthwhile to counterfeit a shekel than it is to counterfeit a dollar or a euro. So cyber threat is a threat, but for example, the risk of counterfeiting and double spending the digital shekels is probably less significant than it is for the more advanced economies.
Okay, so Israel may be subject to more cyber attacks, but less subject to cyber counterfeiting? Is that what you're saying?
Probably.
Okay, so the pros and cons of being Israel, I suppose, there. We didn't break the ice with Project Icebreaker, but let's talk about that now. Again, it's a project between the Bank of International Settlements, Sweden, Norway, and Israel, looking at cross-border retail payments and remittances. Give us a brief overview of that.
Right. Let me give a kind of a general concept for a second. Think once again about cash, okay? Let's assume that you're coming from the US to Israel to visit your family, and I'm coming from Israel to the US. I need to buy dollars against shekels. You need to buy shekels against dollars. We don't know that we're actually doing these, traveling the opposite directions. I don't know that you need dollars, you don't know that I need shekels. But if we did, we could both exchange our currencies, for example, at the airport or something like that, and we would not have to pay 2 or 3% to our financial institutions for this foreign exchange conversion. So as we are taking cash to becoming digital, we may be able actually to allow people to make foreign exchange transactions with central bank money more simply and with less risk than it is currently with the financial system. How would that work? So for example, you can think of an Israeli wanting to make an e-commerce purchase from IKEA in Sweden or something like that. The Israeli would be paying with their digital shekels. IKEA would be receiving e-kronas in Sweden. We would probably need some kind of a foreign exchange provider in the middle who would be holding both currencies, but the transaction would be almost completely atomic, meaning that as opposed to the case currently in cross-border transactions, where we have the corresponding banking model and transactions can take days before they reach from the payer to the payee, the transaction would be probably completed in seconds and without any counterparty risk or credit risk to the people at the end of the transaction.
Are the banks in the middle that you're taking out of this equation taking issue with this prospect because they would be losing on a business model?
They would need to probably make their systems and their models more efficient. They would need to modernize as well to create a more competitive. I mean, banks have, I can tell you in Israel, and you've testified to that also in the beginning. The payment system in Israel has become much more efficient over the course of the last 5 or 6 years. Things that we can do domestically are much more than we were able 5 or 6 years ago. However, in the cross-border sphere, it is still relatively slow, relatively expensive. Israelis pay 2.5% or 3% of the credit card companies when they make an e-commerce transaction. They can pay dozens of dollars for a cross-border transfer, for example.
So what are you seeing with Project Icebreaker, that this is indeed a more efficient way to go ahead and do this?
So Project Icebreaker is still currently just on paper, okay? So it's just ideas. We're building the prototype right now. Hope to be able to implement it by the end of the year. Once again, just a prototype. And then we will try to learn from this prototype. Are we actually able to do with CBDCs things that we are not able to do with commercial bank money these days?
And of course, this brings the issue of interoperability, how all of these systems work together, how central banks will work with other central banks. Where do we stand on that? Has there been some kind of coordination? What are the challenges and issues with interoperability?
Right, so one of the goals really of Project Icebreaker is to try to inform the global central banking community about how we all need to advance with our CBDCs, which we are building domestically and locally and planning domestically and locally. How can we advance with them, not making the same mistakes that we did decades ago with the commercial banking system and the corresponding banking system, so that we can build our systems so that they are able to interoperate with each other. For example, in Project Icebreaker, we will be building a hub that will be speaking in a single language. So each CBDC system needs to adjust itself to the language of the hub. So we, Sweden, Norway, we both built our POCs unrelated to each other. And in the project, we will be building this hub, which will actually be doing all of the communications between the 3 different systems. If we turn out successful, we will hopefully prove that perhaps one single, what we call hub and spoke model will be able actually to connect all of the CBDC systems, hopefully even agnostically to whatever is the technology of each CBDC system. But definitely this is the core of the project, to build this hub and to be able to connect between the systems.
And all of these global transactions would then be on the blockchain?
So not necessarily. So it depends. Each CBDC system could be built in its own manner. However, the characteristic of the project is that in each CBDC system, you need to be able to perform a locking of the funds for a limited amount of time until the transaction on the other side was completed. So there needs to be some kind of entity that can transmit to the other side, I locked the money on the payer's side, you can now pay the money to the payee, and once you do that, I will also unlock the money out of the payer's
Wouldn't
side.
that be a smart contract?
Exactly, a smart contract. Do we need blockchains to perform smart contracts? So the POCs currently in the both countries, in the 3 countries, are based on blockchains. Ours and Norway's are on Ethereum blockchain. Sweden have built their e-krona project on Corda. But I'm not sure, once again, this is a technical question, but it is not necessarily the case that you need CBDCs in order to perform, it's that you need blockchains in order to perform these smart contracts.
Who would be writing the smart contracts? Because that in itself could be an issue in how they're written and how they're programmed.
That's a good question. I would assume that you can talk about smart contracts in CBDCs in general, and you can talk about what we're doing in Icebreaker. So currently in Icebreaker, so each central bank is writing actually the smart contract that would lock the money. So it's really kind of, you can think about it as a liability of the central bank or of the CBDC system to be the trusted party that is actually locking the money.
Okay. What would this mean for the SWIFT system if this is a success? Does that render the SWIFT system obsolete then?
I think SWIFT are the ones that need to ask this question to themselves. Project Icebreaker is working on retail transactions. Okay, it is me, doing a cross-border transaction with IKEA or whatever. Me as an end user paying remittances to my cousin in Norway or something like that. SWIFT have a very significant business model also in the wholesale system, but I definitely do think that SWIFT and others need to recalculate their existing business model, which has served the global economy very well, but has its advancement that it needs to do. By the way, one policy question that we will be asking ourselves within Project Icebreaker is who should be building this, who should be in real life, not in the experiment, who should be building and maintaining this hub? Should it be a collaboration of the central banks? Should it be an institution like the IMF or the BIS? Should it be maybe a private institution such as SWIFT or others? This is a policy question for itself. Who is the institution that should be maintaining this entity that would be connecting all of the CBDC systems together?
And would that entity have the power to take out players, as we're seeing with sanctions, for example, against Russia being taken off the SWIFT system? Is that something that technologically would be feasible in this kind of system?
This entity would be operating under rules that would be determined for it. And once again, it is relatively easy to think of the technical implementations of it. I'm assuming that for countries to sit down and decide on the set of rules that would manifest this would, of course, be a political process that would have to take place.
Again, a lot of philosophical and ideological issues here. One of the big concerns is the idea of power outages and no Wi-Fi. I barely have Wi-Fi in the conference center here, and it's a technology conference, and I can barely get Wi-Fi. So what would that mean on an individual level, if people aren't able to have power, if people aren't able to access their Wi-Fi, and also on a broader governmental level, if there is a bigger sort of power outage dynamic or even some kind of magnetic pulse attack? We'll start for the individual level.
No, I mean, but you only want to look at the dark side of that.
I'm a concerned citizen of the world. I'm a concerned citizen of the world, and I'll tell you what concerns me is that this initiative has really been spearheaded by the People's Bank of China with very, shall we say, potentially not so positive objectives. So looking at some of the risks and issues here, but let's go back to this idea of Wi-Fi and power outages before we circle back to China. On the individual level, what happens? I don't have Wi-Fi, my batteries run out. Oh, there's a power outage at launch.
Okay. So you're touching the very fascinating discussion, whether do we need to allow CBDCs to operate offline? Okay, and there are experiments on this, both in China, other countries have experimented this. We actually have not experimented it yet, but we are thinking about it. Is there a need for CBDC to be able to operate offline?
Could they operate offline?
Well, they could if you design them to, but there are design choices that you would need to make. For example, one technology to do it, for example, could be so that, where's my phone? Okay, so I could have my CBDC wallet applicable in my phone, and my phone could be connected to the network, and then I could see my CBDC balance. And then I could decide to move a part of my balance. I could move 100 shekels for my overall balance locally into my device. And then the tokens would be placed on my device. Okay? And then if I want to pay you, and you and I both don't have internet, it doesn't even necessarily need to be internet. We don't have access to the cellular system. I could theoretically physically move my tokens from my phone to your phone, for example, via Bluetooth or via NFC or something like that. However, if I moved tokens from my account into my device, what happens if I lose my device, or my device goes underwater or something like that? So, I mean, even if I go underwater, cash will still be applicable when it's sunk in the water. If I lose cash, I lost my cash. That's it. So this is kind of a risk that you need to manage. Okay, how much offline CBDC will you want people to hold? Another way to do offline is, for example, for the transaction to be cleared at a later time. So, for example, let's assume that I have a connection, you don't. Okay, I could be sending you the CBDCs. Since your wallet is not active right now because you're not connected, the transaction could clear later. However, at this point, if I made a transaction to you and you weren't able to verify this transaction, you're actually taking a risk. Okay, what happened if I sent you forged tokens or something that you weren't able to verify them against the network? Who will be liable to this risk? If it is the central bank that's liable to the risk, it actually means that the central bank is actually taking a credit risk here, which is something that we want to do. So there are all sorts of technologies available to allow for offline transactions of CBDCs. None of them come without risk. So there once again need to be a policy decision, which we will need to weigh against the risk that you described in the beginning of the question. How big indeed is the risk of everybody going completely offline, no power, for how long? And maybe we can, at these situations, go back to cash.
Well, which is why you're saying that Israel is not looking to take cash out of the system.
And no other central bank that I'm aware of, by the way.
Okay, because power outages, unfortunately, are becoming more and more regular with the energy crisis that we're seeing. I'm going to Johannesburg after my visit to Dubai, and Johannesburg has regular scheduled power outages. They have load shedding, as they call, and at least several times a week, there's no power, there's no electricity, there's no Wi-Fi. We're seeing rolling blackouts in states like the US and California. We're seeing that in Europe, we're facing energy crisis.
Right. So once again, these are risks that you need to weigh one against the other. Actually, in our looking into the question of whether we would need to apply offline or not, we have actually looked at data regarding the extent of power outages and internet outages in Israel as compared to other countries. We found that they are relatively low. So it may mean that maybe the risk of allowing offline is actually bigger than the risk of not allowing it. But this is, once again, this is a discussion that we'll continue to do down the road.
And my doomsday scenario of some kind of electric magnetic pulse attack not featuring is a concern?
I must say this is not one of the risks that we have put in our risk chart, but of course, everything should be thought about. But then again, once again, if this happens, it's not just about CBDCs, right? I mean, as you said in the beginning of our discussion, right? You said most of our money is already in the digital banking system already. So it's not, this risk needs to be thought about, not just in the context of CBDCs.
But as long as there's still a physical cash alternative out there,
but there will be a physical cash alternative, at least for the foreseeable future.
All right, so let's talk about the risks that you are looking at, because we said Israel has not yet made a decision. So what is in the pro column? What is in the con column? What are the factors that are sort of deterring Israel from moving ahead with this?
So in the pro column, there's all these motivations that I outlined at the beginning of our discussion, okay? Competition, innovation, resilience of the payment system, cross-border payments options, and the like. In the risk side, so first of all, there's, as we discussed earlier, there's the risk to the financial system and to the banking system, okay? So, and this is really a risk that, we can model and we can put in all sorts of regressions or stuff like that, but we can never know what will really happen in real life. So we need to really think it through. And of course, all the risks that we discussed earlier, the cybersecurity risk, all of these operational risks. I mean, this is central bank money we're talking about. If we fail to do this correctly, okay, operationally, and we do a bad job, the reputation of the central bank, which, as you understood correctly, I strongly believe in, and I think it is a very important asset for the public in general and for the economy in general, the reputation of the central bank could be in risk here. So you really need to think through that you know how to do this well. But also, as you said earlier, there isn't really an urgent need. I mean, look, for example, at the country that was the first to issue CBDCs, the Bahamas, for example. They had a major hurricane, I believe, in 2018, if I remember correctly. People were not able to actually access their ATMs. They made the decision to issue a CBDC in 2019, if I remember correctly, and they were live in the air in 2020. But they had a really urgent need, okay, because of the environmental risks there. We don't have an urgent need currently in Israel, so we have the time to take it through, to look it through, to think about all the implications, to do these international collaboration that we're doing. But more important than the subject itself, that we're looking into each of these international collaborations with the Nordics and with Hong Kong, it's the collaboration itself, the opportunity to sit together, to learn from each other, to think about the risks that we've all thought about.
I take it that Israel is taking its time, carefully assessing this from many, many aspects. But can there be a scenario where countries do not get on board with a program? If the whole world starts to move in this direction, we know that China has been leading the charge with the digital yuan. Sources tell me that the ECB could be next with their central bank digital currency. Is it going to be a question of you now have to play the game, that you kind of have to participate even if you're not ready or not quite ready?
I think that most countries are actually looking at CBDCs mainly for their domestic concerns, so in order to improve their domestic payment systems. Actually, it was I think it was the G20 that made an announcement that when countries will be issuing CBDCs, they will be making sure that they do not harm the financial stability of other countries, for example. So I think if the ECB, for example, moves ahead and issues its digital euro, which I think would be a fascinating thing for itself, it will not necessarily mean that Israel must therefore issue a digital shekel. Actually, I even foresee a scenario where maybe there will be several major economies who decide to move on and others that will not. And therefore, each country will actually need to make its own decision based mainly on its own circumstances.
So it's not going to be a situation where everybody's going to move to central bank digital currency just to keep up with the other countries?
I don't know, of course, but I think that every country will be making its own considerations, and even within every country, there are voices in each.
What kind of timeline would it be, do you think, before Israel launches one, if it does go ahead with it?
I don't want to give a timeline. I can say that we are still in the process of doing what we call an action plan. So we are still in preparation. I can definitely say that if the current governor or whoever is in charge comes down to us and says, okay, we need to be ready relatively soon, we will need to put in much more resources than we're putting into this today. Our project currently is relatively modest in international comparison teams. I mean, teams, for example, in other countries like Canada, Sweden, are dozens of people working on this. We are not at this scale yet. So if we do, we will still need to put much more resources into it if we want to move forward quickly.
One of the other issues on an economic side of things is that this will give central banks another tool to manage the economy. That if you have a central bank digital currency, you're able to directly stimulate the economy by adding money to people's digital wallets, and maybe even conversely take out liquidity, which is more challenging of a concept, by withdrawing money from people's digital wallets to fight things like inflation, for example. Is that being considered, how this could be used as a potential economic policy tool, and what has been the thinking there?
So actually in your question, you really touched on CBDC both as a fiscal tool in the earlier part of your question and as a monetary tool in the latter part. I can say that for both, actually thinking about it as a fiscal tool, our experience from COVID in Israel was that our national security program was actually very efficient in providing direct COVID support to people, direct COVID transfer, because we already have a pretty good system in place, and it was not a problem for the government once it chose to actually pay direct transfers to, I think, 90 and something percent of the population. So we pretty much have the tools at hand already. I'm not saying CBDCs would not need to be a tool, but it's not a major motivation for us as of now. In terms of CBDC as a monetary tool, we are currently thinking of, if we do issue a digital shekel, that it would bear zero interest. I'm not saying that it would not bear interest at all. I'm saying zero interest, because I think that at the current landscape where we are living, it doesn't seem necessary that we should use this as a monetary tool. We have, our monetary system is operating well enough, and the central bank has its tools to influence the economy with monetary policy. However, you never know what will happen in decades. I think the last decade and a half have showed us that we could be in monetary situations that we never believed that we would be. So we do think that we need to leave the technical possibility of applying interest rates, positive or negative, to CBDC in the future. But no, for the foreseeable future, we're thinking of this similar to cash, as a means of payment that doesn't carry interest, just something for people to transact with each other.
You have this whole idea of you never know is exactly what concerns me, because you would never in a million years think that the government of Israel would put restrictions on its people as it did during the pandemic, during COVID. I live in New York. You would never in a million years think that New York City would impose forced shutdowns. And that's exactly one of the issues, again, that I go back to with central bank digital currencies.
While I, as a citizen, do have some critiques about how my government implemented this, I do believe I do believe that the decision makers really had pretty much just the general public interest in mind. So, people make mistakes and people have, motivations and stuff like that. But yeah, we never thought that there would be such a pandemic. And I think my government, as many other governments, tried to do whatever was best for the public. Did they sometimes deviate? Yeah, I, as a citizen, was mad at them at some points, but
yeah, again, the bigger picture is this idea of government overreach, government restrictions, combined with a tool that makes it easier to do so. So, allay my concerns of my nightmare scenario. We're several decades into the future, maybe 2 decades into the future. I have a microchip implanted in me that has my digital ID as well as my digital wallet, because that's a lot easier than carrying around a smartphone or a smart bracelet or what have you. And the government doesn't like something that I've said, doesn't like the way I'm spending my money, and now has the ability to censor my spending, evict me from the financial system. Why should I not be worried about that?
I'm not saying you shouldn't. I'm saying this should be part of the social and political debate that is taking place on these issues already. And the CBDC discussion is no different than how we're discussing the privacy elements of our use of social media and the ability to monitor and track us using our smartphones for other matters. I'm a monetary economist by training. This discussion.
All these philosophical, ideological issues.
These discussions are important, but what I'm saying is that we should not refrain from considering CBDCs because we should be refraining from these discussions.
Right.
We should be considering CBDCs within the scope of these discussions that which are taking place. And if at the end of the day, our social choice discussion will be that this is a way too much into the control of the government or whatever, then we could decide not to do it. But it's a discussion we need to have.
Final thought is how cryptocurrencies fit into all of this, because in this scenario that I've pointed out, a lot of people like to say that one would still have the ability to transact using Bitcoin, for example, which would not be subject, or perhaps less subject, to government control. How do you see cryptocurrencies fitting in with the idea of central bank digital currencies, and in particular Bitcoin?
I think cryptocurrencies so far have failed to pose an option as a means of payment. They have all sorts of characteristics as an asset, as an investment asset, and maybe even a speculative asset. But we don't really see people making payments with crypto so far because of all sorts of characteristics of crypto that you're probably more familiar than I am. So I think I don't see CBDCs as competing with crypto. People who are holding and using crypto are not using it as a means of payment to pay each other for their groceries or whatever. And this is what we are trying to implement, another way for the public to make their day-to-day payments. So I don't really see these two elements competing with each other.
But do you see them coexisting, happily coexisting?
Yes, I think cryptocurrencies or crypto assets, in my view, they still need to prove their case and their validity for day-to-day use of people, and they could definitely coexist. I think cryptocurrencies should be regulated. Regulated. I'll even take you another step. We at the Bank of Israel are currently thinking about regulation of stablecoins, okay, which could probably be used as a means of payment. I, as the project manager of CBDC, I'm not saying, hey, let's not discuss stablecoins because they would be competing with CBDCs. Not at all. I think if stablecoins do pose a viable and a regulated and a safe means of payment for the public, let's have them in, and let's consider them against and together with CBDCs, and against and together with standard bank accounts and standard payment apps, and whatever can bring more prosperity and more innovation to the public should be adopted if it's safe and it can be regulated.
Yoav, I really appreciate the positive spin you have on this. I really appreciate and respect the faith that you have in the institutions of the state of Israel. And I understand that there are still a lot of issues that need to be ironed out, a lot of technological and philosophical debates that need to be had, a lot of discussions that it's still very much a work in progress. But I thank you for your work in helping me understand this particular issue as it comes to the digital shekel. So thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me. And once again, I think these are the discussions that need to be held. So it wasn't an easy conversation, but this is the type of conversation that we need to make also in the public debate in Israel as well.
All right, Yoav Soffer, toda rabah.
Toda, Michelle.
Kitco News special coverage of the Future Blockchain Summit is brought to you by Coin Payments, crypto payments made easy.